morning. I just want to remind everyone that the third presentation today, just before lunch, is a question and answer session. It'll be our first of this camp meeting. So I will still be presenting after that tomorrow. But I believe Elder Tabo and Elder Parminder have finished their series of presentations. I may still be able to write, to answer questions in presentations tomorrow. So if there's a lot of questions, I'll try and answer some in the presentations. But particularly also your questions for Elder Tabo and Elder Parminder. They won't have an opportunity to do that. So if you want your questions answered, they'll need to be written and handed in. And they can answer those for you in the question and answers. So that'll be our third presentation today. It will be a Q&A. So I made the claim yesterday that we're in a dangerous time period on our reform lands. When we look at history, the end of ancient Israel, we identify the primary waymark as the cross. That takes us to November 9, 2019. And Ellen White describes the period before the cross, Gethsemane, and then the period up to his death as Christ's last great battle with Satan. We take the quote from Isaiah 52:14. We apply that to his time in Gethsemane. Isaiah 52:14 says, "Many were astonished at thee. His visage was so marred, more than any man, and his form more than the sons of men." So we understand that Christ's suffering in this time period is a fulfillment of Isaiah 52:14. And this is a battle, his last great battle with Satan. If he fails here, the great controversy is lost. We do this through the history of the end of ancient Israel. Make this primary application of the cross. But then we can go to another history. It's not the story about the end of ancient Israel. It's a story about Christ's life as a priest. And when we do that, this waymark, he turns 30 years old. He's born at the time of the end. And those first 30 years a preparation for him to do the work of a priest after the order of Melchizedek. Which is how we define our job function. So this waymark becomes baptism. When we talk about Christ's baptism, we can tend to think his ministry began here, but it didn't. The 30 years of training had been completed. But there was a final finishing touch. And I will read from CTR 192.4. She talks about his baptism. And then instead of going to work, he goes into the wilderness. He was led by the Spirit of God. He goes into the wilderness to fast and to pray and to consider his mission and work. So I said yesterday, the only thing that tells us how to behave is reform lines. It's only by knowing where you are in a reform line, you know how to behave. I can see my sister at the back can't see. There's still 2 seats up here if you want to move. So she talks about the time in the wilderness. He goes there to consider, to pray and to fast and consider the work he's about to do. So perhaps we should think about what we're meant to be doing. What it means to fast and pray. There's 2 seats here on this side. If you want to move, my brother, if there's not room there. There's another seat here. So perhaps that's something we should consider. When we have this time period between Raphia and Panium, how Christ fasted and prayed, and he's considering the work he's meant to be doing, treating it with a degree of solemnity. He knows the implications of this work and the necessity of his preparation. It was a time period that God gave him to prepare. So every single one of us should be considering our training and preparation. If you're a sister and you don't think you can teach, what use are you making of your preparation? Brother and sister, if you're not sure if you understand the message, if you don't have faith in the movement, this is the last chance to become firm in those subjects. So Christ is fasting and praying and considering the work he's about to do. He was bracing himself for the blood-stained path he was about to travel. But Satan saw him in the wilderness and thought he's vulnerable. This was the last battle. This was the first battle. His first great battle with Satan. If he loses here, the whole great controversy is lost. Ellen White tells us if he loses here, the whole great controversy is lost. And then she says, Christ is weak, he's starving, Do you have the word emaciated? Worn and haggard. There's mental agony. And then she applies Isaiah 52:14. The same verse that talks about his visage being marred. So we can take his last great battle and his first great battle. And they come into this history back to front, covering the time period leading up to our shut door and the time period in our harvest. We find that there's a battle here that puts the great controversy in jeopardy. There's a battle here that puts the great controversy in jeopardy. So the reason that I'm saying that we're in a dangerous time period is because if you think this was dangerous, we've come out of this experience, but we've entered into this one. If you have the phrase, out of the pan into the fire. We haven't come into this nice, peaceful time period where we can put down our guard and have a nice rest before going to work. That's not the purpose of this time period. It's to fast and pray, consider our role in this movement, understand correctly the work we're about to do, consider the message we're about to take, come into unity on that message, and what makes that whole process difficult is Satan saw us as weak and attacked, and there's an attack here. So we're not going to go into what that attack was now. I just wanted to clarify why I said that we are in a time period that is dangerous. Because you all know how many brothers and sisters we lost here. This is a shaking, and there's two groups. There's the movement that trusts in reform lines, and then there's all those that leave. Don't trust in reform lines. When you come to Christ in the wilderness, you do not have that visibility. All you have is Christ. So you have to compare and contrast. People left in this history, in the wilderness you only see Christ. Will people leave? Will people leave? Yes, people will leave. You have to compare and contrast to understand that. So we want to know how to be safe. And I'm suggesting no one would have left if they understood and accepted reform lines. They had to lose their confidence in reform lines to separate from this movement. So we went back to those reform lines. And I wanted to prove one specific point. The Midnight Cries presented September and October of 2018. Other than private conversations, the first open attack against this message was Elder Jeff in April. And the attack he's going to make was the message of half right and half wrong. He's not going to make it against the Midnight Cry message, but against 2012. But what he's saying is the message of Samuel Snow was half wrong. He applies that to 2012. But everyone knows that if you're going to do it to the Midnight Cry, that's an application. The half wrong must be here. Which leaves him with an interesting problem. Right now, since he left this movement, his whole point is that this was perfect. That his message and its formalization was perfect. And he wants to argue that Miller and Snow were both half right and half wrong. Which means he needs to acknowledge he's half wrong. But he doesn't want to do that. He says perfect, half wrong, half wrong. So as soon as he taught that, it's these lines of the King of the North and the King of the South that were presented. They'd already been done in October, and we had already made the point. You can't take a history of the beginning, the Alpha history, and drop everything wholesale into the Omega. For the King of the North, the end of the Alpha history is failure. If it was success, there would be no Omega. If Hitler had won World War II, there would be no United States fighting the Soviet Union or Russia. There would have been no Cold War to fight. The only reason we have World War III is because World War I and World War II failed. For the King of the North. So we're not just given this final switch. It's locked into place by a pattern. At the beginning of each line, there's no difference between the Alpha and the Omega. Then you come to around halfway through that line, and there's a switch that occurs between an Alpha and Omega history. In the history of success, that starts badly for the King of the North, but in the end he is victorious. We've seen Donald Trump lose twice to Putin, in 2018 and 2019. And we know that all of that gets turned around at the Battle of Panium. But the histories start the same. We took that to our reform lines. These are not lines of reform. Our reform lines are the biblical histories of Moses and John, Miller and Jeff. covering ancient and modern Israel. Consistently in every history, the first angel is wrong at the beginning on some points. Specifically, how they see the kingdom of God. That is consistent for the first part of our reform lines. And then you get to about halfway through, and the second messenger arrives in a history of failure. He continues the same work as the first. Continues the same errors, leading to disappointment. In a history of success, the second messenger is able to correct. Not everyone understands, not everyone accepts. But the correction in the message occurs. We went to the history of Christ and talked about John and Jesus. Both arrive at the time of the end. John is going to give a message, raise up a movement. But he has a wrong idea about the kingdom. He thinks it's an earthly theocracy. Christ must come and correct that. If you went to the history of the Millerites, what Miller taught and what Samuel Snow taught were the same thing. The error continued all the way to the shut door, which resulted in failure. So we cannot take the failure, which is really the failure of the second messenger, from a history of failure and apply it to a history of success. We've already applied 1844 and 1888. Both become histories of failure. We could go back into this history of 1844, and it's the history of World War I and World War II for the counterfeit. Whether we talk about the state, Germany, or the church, the papacy, do these wars end in success or failure? Failure. Disappointment. You come to 1989. Here you have the papacy. We take these two dates from the lines of the counterfeit. How does John Paul do in 1989? This is the kingdom of the true king of the north. This is the kingdom of the counterfeit king of the north. I won't prove it here, it's been done before. This looks like success, but it's failure. Which is why the papacy is in no better condition, no more powerful than it was in the history of John Paul. If anything, less so. Less powerful. But we know in the Sunday law history, the deadly wound heals. So is that failure or success? We have failure, success. So we can't go to the history of failure and say that the second angel has a mistake in understanding the nature of the kingdom. And we've done that with multiple witnesses. In fact, in a history of success, that mistake must be and is corrected. So then people say the following. The first angel was half right and half wrong in his message. The second angel they can't argue with. If you take them to the lines. My concern is that they're no longer trusting the lines. But then people do the following. Elder Parminder has taught the first angel equals the third angel. And they say the first angel is half wrong. So the third angel is half wrong. There's a problem with their methodology because there's a reason that the first equals the third. You cannot take every characteristic of the first and say it's equal to the third. They do different work. So that's one problem. It's the wholesale taking of everything that applies to the first and applying it to the third. The second point that I ask them, go to a reform line and demonstrate it. Go to any reform line and demonstrate this dynamic. I want to take you to the light of the 144,000. You have the errors of the first angel. And then at the time of the end, at 9/11, if you followed Elder Parminder's presentations, you have the arrival of the second and the arrival of the third. And they're going to run concurrently all the way till the close of probation. So you would have to come to the conclusion that this third angel, that message has mistakes from 9/11 to Daniel 12:1. And if that message is half wrong from 9/11 to Daniel 12:1, we're in a serious trouble. Not only that, when they do this, they have to acknowledge that the second angel does not have that mistake. So if this message is perfect and it's running concurrently with the third, these messages must be in open disagreement to each other. When people do this, they don't understand the placing of the third angel. They want to say, first angel, mistake. Second angel. Just by the pattern of doing this, they're forced to say second angel is true. Then they want to put the arrival of the third in 2014, which Elder Parminder has demonstrated is incorrect, and say in this history, third angel is half wrong. And if they understand the third angel ends at the shut door, does not go into the harvest, creates a further problem for them. So I want us to see the problems when we take this concept and apply it to a reform line. issues are highlighted when you place the angels correctly. The second and the third arrive at 9/11, whether it's for the priests or the 144,000. So if they're trying to correct the mistakes of this movement, correct our third angel's message, they have a serious problem. Because that third angel's message is going to go from 9/11 to Daniel 12:1. So at what point do they expect it to be corrected? Because the first angel does not correct his mistakes all the way to the closing of his work. It's only the second that corrects it. So if the first is half wrong all the way through, then you come to the third, it must be wrong all the way through. If you're going to make that experience equal. So our third angel's message is wrong all the way through. And that suits them when they want to put the end in 2019. And then say that they're going to fix the errors of the third angel. You can't do that on the line of the 144,000. And that second and third began at the same point in time. They're running all the way through. So they have a couple of problems. First of all, taking something from history of failure that does not work in a history of success. Second, they're not applying the angels correctly. And third, they're not being consistent in identifying that this mistake must go all the way to Daniel 12:1. Which means their efforts to correct that mistake are pointless. It won't be corrected. They mistake what is meant by saying the first equals the third. And my question constantly to people is to take it to any reform line, preferably use them intelligently, such as identifying failure and success, and prove this point. And the warning is, that's how Elder Jeff started. Divorcing himself from reform lines and twisting points because it suited his message that this movement is conservative. It fits his idea of the nature of the kingdom. And people are doing the exact same thing, using the same methodology, divorcing themselves from reform lines, twisting points that don't make that application, to say this movement is liberal, to build evidence that supports their idea of the nature of the kingdom. They don't realize they're using the exact same methodology. Or lack thereof. So I want to move past that. I want us to consider why people are having this misunderstanding. We talked about the increase of knowledge, not as it relates to the message, but there's a mechanism that God sets up where God gives an increase of knowledge, showing how that message can be shared. The Protestant Reformation, you have the printing press. Allows the sharing of the message. Just something to consider. If you were to go back to the days of Christ, why was that the right time for Christ to be born? Sorry, my brother.
Is it because of Greek education?
Greek education? Finally, when you get to that history, you have the Roman Empire in relative peace to make all of these roads everywhere can be reached. You know the phrase, all roads lead to Rome. Rome had set up a system that Babylon, Medo Persia and Greece did not have. And for that brief period, you have all the known world connected by road systems in relative peace. So when Paul wants to spread the gospel, he has all the road systems, or he can go on ship and reach the whole of the known world for that time period. Ellen White tells us that that was the specific time where Christ could come. So even there you see God has set up all of the external mechanisms needed. God has created the right environment. Then when you come to the Reformation, it's like how we consider a line of progression. He could only give us so much at one point in time. There's no way the internet was coming in the time of the Protestant Reformation. People did not have that level of knowledge. So that they're going to have an increase of knowledge on the printing press. That is the right environment for sharing the message. Then you come to the time of the Millerites. Now, as you come to the end of ancient Israel, there's going to be massive advancements, particularly when it comes to transport and the dissemination of information. So we focused on the steamboats and trains. You have the beginning of the automobile, the beginning of the car. I mean automobile, not train car. But they don't become serious in this history. It's mostly steamboats and trains. It allows for the rapid spread of the message. Miller used them. We read about Joseph Bates, Ellen White. That was their means of travel. And they could reach all corners of the United States rapidly with the message. Then you have the beginning of the telegraph. The ability to spread information rapidly from one corner to another corner without physical presence. So all of this comes right on time for the message. 1825, trains, passenger trains. 6 years later, Miller's having to travel. We come to our reform line, and just in time, God's giving another increase of knowledge and creating the right environment that this message can be as successful as possible. We have the introduction of the World Wide Web, described as the Big Bang of the Internet, and how that grew into Google, developed into YouTube. What would this movement be without YouTube? That platform alone. Who is it there for? Who is it there for? Us. Only reason it's there. The only reason it exists. The whole point of the internet is the work of God to spread this message. It has no other purpose. And without it, without the internet or YouTube, without the World Wide Web, exactly how would we spread this message? Think about what it means to this movement. So we have our own increase of knowledge on technology. I wanted to make the point that these things are for our benefit. That's why we find their development at the time of the end. All through this increase of knowledge and formalization. And there's something else that's for our benefit. We find that it's not just us that use that media, but everyone. So we start introducing a few individuals. Elder Tabo has already spoken about Jerry Falwell and all that history. So it should be fresh in your minds. The moral majority, leading to the election of Reagan. This whole conservative evangelical movement. And then they find their platform, their mouthpiece, their ability to speak. In 1996 with Fox News. That's directly connected to the rise of this conservative evangelical movement. The same time as you see the beginning stages of this liberal movement. Michael Moore and AOC. I just wanted us to make that point. That they are relevant to the line of the 144,000. Otherwise, we would not find them at the time of the end. Because the time of the end for the world is 25 years later. So while we'll talk about Michael more, his relevance for the Nethinims, he's relevant for us. It's the only point I wanted to make by drawing him into the time of the end. So I want to, if you're at the school, you'll remember these points, but I want to remake them. When it came to the message shared last year, we focused a lot on the fact that we were in the dispensation of the plowing of the Nethinims. We made a lot of conclusions from that. One of the chief conclusion, and the one that more than anything else divided this movement, was that at the formalization of our message, there was a messenger raised up and a message given. That was a life and death message. So for the Nethinims, we know that they're harvested in this history. We have no problem calling this the harvest. From Sunday law to the close of probation. Don't think anyone has a problem calling this the harvest. But the minute you say harvest, you're going to the model of agriculture. So FFA would say that they're harvested. But you can't have a harvest without a latter rain, an early rain, the planting of that seed, and the preparation of the ground. So it becomes an inevitable conclusion. If you have a harvest, at some point the ground was prepared. So what prepared it? Just as what prepared us. The ground must be prepared by life and death message. And then all that we had to do was understand what this life and death message was. That's a fundamental point where we started to split from FFA. It seems mild, but the implications of that for a conservative American was serious, because it started to conflict with their preconceived ideas. It conflicted openly with their understanding of the nature of the kingdom. Prior to that history, Elder Jeff was teaching. When we go to the world, the people who will mostly come in are those good Protestant conservatives who read their Bibles. There was a problem with that understanding before we ever changed our understanding of the nature of the Sunday law. We know full well at the Sunday law, Saturday Sunday issue, that those conservative Protestants are not on our side. They're our threat. If we want to build that 1888 Sunday law model. But that was Elder Jeff's understanding of the people we would reach. Because despite their problems, he saw them as good people. Against all those evil liberals. It connects to his understanding of the nature of the kingdom. And when we did this work, 14 to 19, and talked about the formalization of their message, it became easy to see that the conservatives were not on the right path when you see it as one path leading to the Sunday law. They're already on the wrong side of the issues. The wrong side of freedom. The wrong side of church and state. We had traced the rise of these conservative Protestants through the election of Donald Trump to 2018. And we'd said the Protestants are bad, the Liberals are good. The Liberals are good. They're on the right side of this history. They're protesting church and state. They believe in liberty of conscience. They believe in the Constitution. They're fighting against the dictatorship. And all the relevant subjects of that history, they're good. We meant that prophetically. But when that is said, it conflicts with his understanding of the nature of the kingdom. So the split, the crack happened in the movement right back at its presentation. But to make that point, we repeatedly said last year Liberals are good, Protestants are bad. Conservative Protestants. We meant that prophetically. Then we laid layers and layers of evidence for that. We talked about the work of Jerry Falwell Jr. How the father led to Reagan and Bush, and then the son led to Donald Trump. Both led a conservative evangelical movement. So we could just draw one line. Be better if this was the 144,000. Of just this one rise of conservative evangelicals. The power of apostate Protestants. But when we come to a fractal, we can see that's not so simple. That in fact, they rose here. They did a work at the time of the end. Then they came into the time period of Obama. All that work gets undone. So they must rise a second time. First, it was under the father. then they're going to rise a second time under the sun. First time it led to Reagan, second time to Trump. And the reason that they needed to restart their movement in 2014 was because everything had gone wrong under Obama. So we could go to the 144,000 and just see that rise in power of apostate Protestantism. When we break it down to our line of priests and Nethinims, when we kind of zoom closer into that history, put a microscope on it, you can see that they in fact rise twice. The reason that they have to rise up twice is between the Father and the Son, speaking about the Falwells, comes Obama, a president that undoes all the work of the Father. That's why we can see another rising up of conservative Protestantism from 2014. It's their second rise in opposition to Obama. So we have in prior presentations traced the rise of that movement. I want to speak about the liberal voice, because it's the liberal voice that is formalized. Must give the true message. If we want to understand their plowing, we use parable methodology, and we take something that we know to explain something that we don't know. So we don't well understand their plowing. We need something that we know to teach us what that looks like. And we have two histories that we use to do that. First of all, we must compare and contrast it with the plowing of the priests. Our plowing will explain their plowing. So if we were to compare and contrast, we can already start to add information that we wouldn't know is there without this compare and contrast. There must be a 10-year period that begins to wake up the world. If we go back to 2004, what begins to wake them up? There's a number of significant things that happen in this year. Most historical commentators mark 2004 as the point where Vladimir Putin becomes a dictator in Russia. That's when he starts taking over the election systems and local governments in Russia. But if we're going to keep to our theme, this is Michael Moore, and it's Fahrenheit 9/11. He's going to go into past history, particularly from 2000. He's going to explain 2000 to 2003.
agenda kwogera kuva mu 12 okutuuka mu 23.
And what are his conclusions?
Naye agenda kumaliza naki
He says George Bush
ng'alaga nti George Bush
is an imposter. Should not have been president.
tagwanira kubeera musajja mubi nnyo tagwanira kubeera
He won that election illegally.
nti era yalondebwa mu kyamu.
He's going to explain 9/11.
Agenda kulaga 2
He isn't going to go into conspiracy theories,
agenda kugenda mu byafaayo ebyobulimba aba
but he's going to say
naye agenda kugamba
that this attack of Islam
nti omulimu gw'obusiraamu okulumba Amerika
was used as an excuse
nti kyakozesebwa ng'ekyokwekwasa
for the Iraq War.
okulumbira mu Iraq.
And the Iraq War
Era olutalo lwa Iraq
was illegal.
lwaki telugwanje kubeerawo.
So those being his key points.
Zezimu ku nsonga ze.
George Bush should not have been president.
Bush yandibadde president.
The September 11 attacks were used as an excuse to start a war in Iraq.
Okulumbaganya gwaliyo 2 bwakozesebwa nga kyekwasa okulumba Iraq.
And that Iraq war violated international law.
Era nti olutalo lwa Iraq lwamenya amateeka agafuga ensi yonna.
How many of these agree with prophecy? How many of these agree with prophecy?
Nti bimeka ebikaanya n'obunabbi.
George Bush, who is he in Daniel 11?
Nti George Bush yani mu Daniel 11.
False murders, an imposter.
Nti musajja mubi wa false temis.
9/11,
2
you go to our application of World War I,
tulaba nga tuddamu ebyafaayo bya olutalo olusooka oba sematala asooka.
and you see Austria and Hungary use a terrorist attack as an excuse for a war they already wanted.
Nti Austria-Hungary yeekwasa obulumbaganyi obwaliwo obwakolebwa abayeekera mu kiseera ekyo nesobola okutuukiza ebiruubirirwa byayo.
You go to the Third Diadochi War,
Otugenda mu lutalo olwokusatu olwa Diadochi,
and you see 3 allies
tulaba abanywanyi 3
that we all identify as members of the UN
basobola okulaga kati nti bamemba ba UN
telling the United States, do not do this.
ne bagamba Amerika tugwanidde kukola ekyo.
You do not have the permission of the UN.
Twalina lukusa okuva okuyita mu UN
And they do it anyway.
naye Amerika negenda maaso neekola.
His 3 key points all agree with our prophetic narrative.
Nti ogenda okulaba nti ensonga zisatu ziikanya bungi n'obunabbi.
No good, true apostate Protestant would agree with any one of these.
Teriyo mu Protestanti mutuufu asa kukanya n'ebyo.
Only the liberals would start agreeing with some of
Naye
these.
bano abakyukakyuka abatagwa ne basitakange wamu
Even-
okubiika okukanya nabyo.
Even if they might not have clarity on the points.
Nankubadde abamu tebasobola kuba nga balina bulambukufu obusuka.
So this is the message he starts to spread in 2004.
Bwe bubaka bamaikomu bwatandika okuba nga ayigiriza mu 2004.
You come to 2018
Bwetuuka mu 2018
and he starts to spread a message
atandika okufunya obubaka
about what has happened since 2014.
ng'alaga biki ebyatuukawo mu 2014.
And what he's sharing
Kyagaba naawo
is the following.
bye bino wammanga.
He goes back to 2014
Addayo mu 2014
and he's going to discuss a crisis in Flint, Michigan.
nti agenda kulaga akatyabaga akaliyo mu Michigan.
When he does his first documentary in 1989, it's
Wow.
all about Flint.
Nti bw'akola ekiwandiiko kye mu kiseera ekyo
He's going to say that 2014, that crisis,
agenda kulaga nti mu 2014 akatyabaga akaliyo mu biseera ebyo
was a catalyst for the rise of Donald Trump.
nti kyali kiyamba buyambi kuyimusibwa kwa Donald Trump.
So he's going to pin a beginning point in 2014.
Agenda kuba nga anokolayo nti ebintu ne bitandika ddala mu 2014.
While he doesn't do that with the clarity we do, he's still taking you back to that year.
Newankubadde talina bukakafu nga ffe bwe tuleeta naye atwala ddala ku mwaka gwennyini.
He says Donald Trump
Agamba Donald Trump
is president illegally.
nti alondebwa mu bukyamu era pulezidenti afuga mu bukyamu.
He says Donald Trump is a dictator.
N'agamba ye nakyemalira.
without our prophetic vision,
nga talina kulungamizibwa kwonna kwa bunabbi,
he doesn't have clarity,
talina kumanya kusuukaawo,
but he does say without significant steps,
naye alina kyakulaga kusinza ku ebyabayiseemu,
essentially open revolution,
era nga alaga okukyukakyuka,
Donald Trump will be the last president of the United States.
ye pulezidenti agenda okusembayo mu Amerika.
He says Donald Trump is typified by Adolf Hitler,
Nti n'atulaga nti Donald Trump alaga ddala Hitler, Adolf,
and again without our prophetic glasses,
ate nga talina wadde takozesa giraasi z'obunabbi,
he connects all of this to November 9
agenda byonna n'abikwatagana ne November 9,
and identifies a chiasm
n'ajjayo ne kayazimu,
between 9/11 and 11/9.
n'akawasaganya n'agamba November 9 ne 21.
So how many of his key points agree with prophecy?
Nti points mmeka mu ebyo ezikanya n'ebifiiga leero?
We say 2014 began the dispensation was the catalyst.
Nti tulaba nti 2014 etandika okuba ng'era kyezimba.
Trump won that election illegally
Ntulaba nti Trump abba bubbi obuwanguzi
with the help of Vladimir Putin
ng'ayambibwako Vladimir Putin
and Cambridge Analytica.
ne Cambridge Analytica.
He's a dictator.
Nakyemalira
He's the last president.
ye pulezidenti asembayo
He's typified by Hitler.
alaga Hitler, Adolf.
We take our prophetic glasses to this
Ne tukwata giraasi zaffe ez'obunabbi
and know that there is a connection between 9/11 and November 9.
abantu bali okukwatagana 21 ne November 9.
So he's on the right side of prophecy
Olabira ddala ng'ali ku sayidi entuufu ey'obunabbi
on all of his key points.
nga otuna ensonga zonna z'anokolayo.
He gives that message
Nti awa obubaka obwo
in September and October of 2018.
awa mu September n'October ow'omwaka 2018.
This is where we begin to make our second compare and contrast.
Awo tandika okuba nga tufuna ensonga ey'okuba nga tugeraganya.
We compare and contrast plowing with plowing,
Tugenda nga tugeraganya okukabala n'okukabala wansi.
but then we compare and contrast
Bwe tugenda nga tugeraganya
the dispensation of our latter rain.
nti mu kiseera kyaffe eky'enkuba ey'oluvannyuma
We have a history dispensation from 2014 to 2019.
tulina ebyafaayo okuva mu 2019 okutuuka 2019.
We can compare and contrast it with their experience from 2014 to
Tuyamba
2019.
okuba nga tugeraganya kye bagenda okuyitamu okuva 2014 okutuuka 2019.
We're walking through the same dispensation.
Tutambula mu biseera bye bimu
We're being tested on the same things.
nga tugesebwa n'ekintu kye kimu.
So we want to make two compare and contrasts.
Tukwata ebiri ne tubigeraageranya.
First this one,
Ekisooka kyekyo ekiddako kye wansi
and then this one.
ne tuddako ekyokubiri.
When we do that,
Bwe tukola ekyo
we find the midnight cry
tulaba oluyoogaano amatumbi
was given in September and October 2018.
tulaba mu September ne mu October mu 2018.
September and October 2018.
September October mu 2018.
September and October
Era
2018.
ne September October mu layini ya 2018.
Compare and contrast.
Nti nga tugeraageranya.
But as he's speaking,
Ng'ayogera
there's a second stream.
waliwo ate
And that second stream is the voice of apostate Protestantism.
omugo gw'okubiri lye ddoboozi.
So we find two streams.
Tulaba emiga gya mirundi ebiri.
We find that up in our plowing history.
Tulaba agulawo ekiseera kyabwe eky'okukabala.
You have the voice of the Adventist church structure,
Nti tulinawo nti ku ntandikwa yaffe tulabawo eddoboozi ly'obukulembeze bw'ekkanisa y'Abadiventi
in opposition to the movement
nga liwakanya omugendo
of the priests.
ogw'abakabona.
Compare and contrast.
Bw'ogeraageranya
You have the voice of the structure,
nti waliwo eddoboozi ly'obukulembeze
Donald Trump's government and establishment,
nti obukulembeze bwa Donald Trump ne bafuga nabo
versus the movement of the Nethinims.
nga guwakanya omugendo gw'Abanethinimu.
You have two choices.
Waliwo ebyokondako bibiri.
If you don't have two choices,
Bw'otabira na byakondako nga mirundi ebiri,
this message is not a testing message.
tegeeza nti obubaka bwo nti si tebukugezesa.
You must have more than one.
Ogenda okuba nga olinako ekisuka ekimu okulaba nga olina okulondako.
So the voice of Donald Trump's America is speaking,
Nti eddoboozi Trump yayogera mu Amerika
and it's speaking
ng'ayogera
again through Jerry Falwell,
okuyita mu Jerry Falwell
And he's going to release in October of 2018
ntigenda kufulumya mu mwaka 2018
the Trump prophecy.
obunabbi bwa Trump
Part movie, part documentary.
akyalagibwa obulungi
So this is a documentary.
nti ekyo nakyo biragibwa bulungi
This is a movie / documentary.
era nga n'ekyo n'ebyo byalagibwa bulungi
It says that Trump is Cyrus,
nti obunabbi bwa Trump bugamba nti Trump ye Cyrus aba ye Kuulo mu Bayibuli
he's God's anointed.
era yafukibwako amafuta Katonda.
To quote the White House advisor Paula White,
nti okubanga banokolayo ebigambo eby'omuli w'amagezi Trump
who I know Elder Tabo has made you familiar with.
wano edatabe yamutulaze omukyano ayitibwa Paula
To speak against Trump is to speak against God.
nti bw'oba oyogera ekigambo bw'obanga oyogera obubi ne Trump oba oyogedde obubi ne Katonda.
To vote for a Democrat is to vote for Satan.
Era bw'oba olonda abademokrats oba olonze Setaani
Because Trump walks on White House ground,
kubanga Trump atambula mu White House
that ground is holy.
buli alinnye wonna aba atukuvu
Because her and others walk that ground.
kubanga Paula n'abaala bonna balinnya awo ate nga bakristaayo
And they are God's anointed.
era nti Trump yayiwako amafuta Katonda.
How much of that agrees with our prophetic message?
nti bimeka ebikanya n'obunabi bwaffe
None whatsoever.
teri wadde kimu
And yet FFA's position
ate nga bwetulina position ya FFA
is that all of this is equally wrong, equally wicked.
bagamba nti byonna bituufu
There's no difference between these two streams.
tewaliwo njawulo w'emigo egy'ebiri
You can't justify that with a compare and contrast
osobola okukikakasa kye bwoba ogeraganya
or with prophecy.
nti byonna bunabbi.
So in September and October of 2018,
September October 2018
you have their two streams.
tulaba emigo gya mirundi ebiri
And Michael Moore,
nti Michael Moore
who becomes their messenger,
afuuka omubaka
is raised up from their time of the end.
ng'ava ku kiseera eky'enkomerero
He's going to formalize his message in 2018.
agenda kuba nga obukaka bukakasibwa mu 2018
The same point as ours.
era nga n'ebirala byonna bwe biri.
We also find the other stream formalize a message.
tulaba n'omugomala nga nabo bakakasa obubaka bwabwe.
So the split in this history
nti okwawukana mu byafaayo bino
occurs between two movements.
nti kubeerawo mu migendo ebiri
One has become the government of America
nti emu omugendo gufuuka gavumenti ya America
with a combination of church and state,
era nga beegasamu ekkanisa ne gavumenti
and the other is this movement of Nethinims in opposition to them.
era nga omugendo ogumu gw'abanethiniimu nga baakanya enkola ya gavumenti.
All of these two streams
nti gino emigendo ebiri
are setting up for the crisis of the Sunday law.
nti bonna beeteekera akatyaba g'akajja akasandero
One will enact it,
nti abamu bagenda kugireeta
one will fight against it.
abamu bagenda kugiwakanya.
So we have these two streams at the beginning
tulina emigendo ebiri gino kuva ku ntandikwa
that we speak of roughly
ekyokusobola okwogerako nti
as liberals
nti bale ba liblo
and conservatives,
ne basitakange.
as good and bad.
Bano liblo balungi basitakange babi ba conservative.
So those who are now coming into disagreement with us,
Era abo abalowooza nti tebakanya naffe kati
we all agree on that common point.
fena tukanya ku nsonga eyo
In the plowing, there's two groups.
nti mu kabala tulina ebibinja bibiri.
The liberals are good, the conservatives are bad.
Liblo balungi basitakange abaconservative babi.
I just want to connect Steve Bannon to this history,
Alagala kubanga agatagana Steve Bannon mu byafaayo bino
just reminding that he becomes part of this story.
okulaga nti naye afuuka kitundu ku story eyo.
He believes in the Jewish Christian West.
nti ono naye akkirizaganya mu njigiriza y'ekiyudaaya naye nga ali mu Amerika.
This is all defense of a white Protestant America.
Era ng'ono ye ayimirizaawo kuba nti mu Amerika bagwanidde kubanga bonna bakristaayo ate nga beeru.
So not only is it racist,
tasobola busozi mu mawanga.
we need to identify that everything Steve Bannon does
Twagala okubanga tutegeera byonna Stephen byakola.
is also religious.
Ate ekikira nti asitula mawanga naye ate naye wa ddiini.
It can be easy to look at this history and think it's secular.
Nti okyangu nnyo okutunda ebyafaayo bino n'ogamba nti tebirina makulu.
But he and his followers
ye n'abagoberezi be
likened their work to the Crusades.
nti bakolanye emirimu gyabwe mu makuruseedi
When Christianity rose up and fought against the Muslim hordes,
nti abakristaayo baayimuka ne batandika okuba nga balwanyisa abasiraamu
protected the West
nga bagezaako okuba nti bakuuma America
from these invaders.
okuba nga bataasa America kuba ababayingirira.
So he knows that his whole framework of everything he does has a religious basis.
nti byonna byonna byakola alowooza nti aba atuukiriza ddiini beeyigiriza.
So it's not just Jerry Falwell, it's Steve Bannon.
nti si Jennifer Were yekka ne Steve Bannon
And they're both fighting from a religious base.
nti bonna balwana nga bagamba nti bayimirisaawo ddiini n'abakristaayo.
So the conclusion that people have come to
abantu engeri abantu gye bagenze nga bakomenkereza
when this has been taught over the last 18 months,
bino byayigibwa okumpi emyezi 8 emabega
what I remember teaching
nti abooluganda ngeri gye bayigirizaamu
is that this split, conservatives and liberals,
nti kuno okwawukana kw'abaconservative ne ba liberal
is going to continue to develop.
tibigenda kugenda nga kukula
And the conservatives
era basitakange ba conservative
will enact the Sunday law.
bagenda kuleeta etteeka lya Sunday law.
This is the work of that church-state union.
Guno gwe mulimu gwa kanisa okwegatta n'eddiini oba n'abakristaayo.
We use the quotes, if you're not benefited by the first angel.
Tukozesa ensonga nti oba toganyiddwa mu malayika asooka
We applied the first angel to Michael Moore,
tugamba nti malayika asooka manethanimu yemikomo
and we said all of those followers of Trump
nti abo bonna abagobera Trump
who were not benefited by his message,
tebagenda kugenda mu bubaka bwa mikomo.
there is no point of them receiving a second. They won't receive it.
Era tebagenda kuba nga bafuna malayika owokubiri newankubadde baagala.
They're already choosing their side.
Era nga bamaze okusalawo sayidi yaabwe
They weren't benefited by the first.
tebagenda kuba nga tebafunyeemu mwasooka
They cannot be benefited by the second,
tebasobola kuba nga baganwa mu wokubiri
nor by the loud cry.
ne mu luyogaano lwawaggulu olugenda okuweebwa.
If you remember that quote of Ellen White.
Waba mutujjukirako oti eyo okuva mu Ellen White.
So when we call people out,
Abantu nga bayitibwa wabweru
are we going to be calling out these conservative Protestants?
tugenda kuba nga tuyitayo bano basitakange.
I'm talking about a movement,
Njogera ku mugendo
not saying every conservative Protestant right now is lost.
sigamba nti buli sitakange essaawa eno yabula.
Many of them are in fact protesting Trump,
N'abamu ku bo bawakanya Trump.
so that there's elements within conservative Protestantism,
Nti waliwo ate endowooza eri wakati mu basitakange abaprotestant
people I have hope for.
abantu gye batandise okuba nga batwala.
I'm speaking about a movement,
Njogera ku mugendo
which means that your language becomes what sounds absolute.
nti olulimi luyinza okulemerera okuba nga lutegeerwa
But just know I don't mean it that way.
naye nga sikyategeeza.
If you're not benefited by the first, you cannot be benefited by the second, nor by the loud cry.
Asooka bw'alema okumufunamu okwe tasobola akuyamba n'okusatu n'olyaga tosobola akuyamba.
So when we call people out of Babylon, who leaves?
Nga tuyita abantu abava mu Babuloni bani abavaayo.
It won't be the conservatives.
Tebagenda kubeera baasitakanga ba
It's
conservative.
the liberals
Nti bano ba
who
Liberal
become the Nethinims
abagenda okufuka banisiniimu
and join this movement.
abagenda okwegatta ku mugendo guno.
That was as far as we brought it last year.
Mbetyo bwetwakyeta omwaka oguyise
That it's these conservatives and liberals.
nti abaconservative ne ba Liberal
The liberals
nti aba Liberal
accept the first angel
tebakkiriza malayika asooka
and they're preparing
era nga bateekebwateekebwa
to accept this movement in the history of their harvest.
nti okuba nga bakkiriza omugendo guno mu kiseera ky'amakungula gaabwe.
Conservatives rejected the first angel
Nti basitakange bagaana malayika asooka
and they're all prepared
nti bonna bateekebwateekebwa
to enact and accept the Sunday law.
okuba nga baleeta Sunday ate n'okugiikiriza
They will be our opposition in that history.
bagenda okutulwanyisa mu byafaayo byaffe.
So I hope we can see all of that just makes sense.
Nti asuubira nti tusobola okulaba bino byonna nga bikola amakulu.
what has then happened is people have taken that concept, I would suggest, with an inadequate amount of information. And they've begun to draw conclusions that these lines do not actually prove about these two streams of conservatives and liberals. It's changed their idea of what is right and wrong. Not just for the Nethinims, but for us. It's caused them to change their understanding of vows, of what it means to be part of the kingdom of God. If the liberals are so good, why do they need to keep the Sabbath? How can we come to them with vows in this history where those vows say, if you want to be saved, you have to keep the Sabbath? Doesn't that sound like control and dictatorship? Satan is saying, be part of my kingdom, you have to keep Sunday. We're saying, you want to be part of God's kingdom, you have to keep the Sabbath. We're saying, they're dictators. People are saying, if you tell people they have to keep the Sabbath to be saved, you're just as much a dictator. If you tell people that they need to be vegan, that they need to dress appropriately, all of these reforms, doesn't that make us conservative dictators? So everything we've done so far, I agree with. These two streams developing in the plowing. We have had a very rough look about what that Sunday law history looks like. And because, just based on that information alone, these questions have arisen. So people will say, we're fighting against conservative dictators, but this movement enforces a Saturday Sabbath. So aren't we conservative dictators? Which means this movement must not understand the nature of the kingdom, which means the third angel must be half wrong. I hope you can follow some of their train of thought. I know that's not all of it. But it's all developed based on how we understand the line of the Nethinims. And that's why we're focusing on this reform line. Because on that simple level, you can see why people would start to have these questions. If we don't want to be like those conservative Protestants, with all their controls about what you can and can't do, then don't we have to be like the good liberals? Freedom of thought, freedom of action. No enforced Sabbath keeping to be part of the kingdom of God. And you become part of the kingdom through baptism. So the very beginning of that attack is going to attack the vows. That's where it starts.
awo bitandikira
Because we're saying
because tugamba
that to be part of the kingdom,
okubeera kuno kwakabaka
there's a list of rules.
waliwo amateeka
And that sounds
kiwulikana
like conservative dictators.
okubeera ng'abanakyama era okufaana basitakanga.
So I want to address some of those concerns people have.
Nayagala kulaga ensonga abantu ze baleeta.
We'll look at that in the next
Genda
presentation.
kwangako omusaade eddako.
If you kneel with me, we'll close in prayer.
Kambe tubasabe.
Dear Father in heaven, thank you for our blessings. Thank you for this new day. Lord, it's been a blessed camp. We know that you have been with us. Father, we are grateful for everything you do for us when we look at the care you've taken to us, like a parent, Father, who cares about every detail, the whole environment, that we can do this work. Lord, you've nurtured and cared for us. We know that you have set every system in place. You've given us transport. You've given us the internet. All of these different things, Father, so that as many people as possible can receive this message as accurately and quickly as possible. Lord, I pray that we will take this time, our wilderness time period, to consider our work, both as a movement, understanding who we are, what message we are to give. We know Jesus spent this time contemplating the path that he was about to follow. May we look ahead to our work and as a movement find that preparation and unity. And individually, Lord, I pray that people will consider their role in that work and their personal preparation. I pray, Lord, for our brethren that are struggling with these questions. You know we love them. I hope may they know that we love them, that we just wish them to be part of this work, to not separate from us. I pray, Lord, that they will have faith in the reform lines, that we can have unity on these subjects. Lord, we want to understand your character. We have much to learn. I pray that you'll continue unfolding it to us. In Jesus' name, amen.